Great discussion. I do want to kind of flag one thing. There was a couple of mentions of the Inflation Reduction Act as a marquee policy in the United States. We're about to move into our panel on policy specifically and what levers can be pulled to try and introduce sustainable aviation, clean aviation and hydrogen aviation as quickly as possible. And I'm sure that the representatives from the UK government who will be joining us will point to the Jet Zero strategy. After this session, we're actually going to hear from the aviation minister in the UK in a pre-recorded message, and she will talk through some of the things that are planned there. So with that in mind, and wanting to keep a little bit to time, we probably will continue a little bit past 6:30 with this next panel, just so that we can provide an ample time to get through all of the meaty subject matter. And with that, I want to introduce our moderators. So we're very lucky to have Matthew Houlsby, who's Director of Net Zero Transition at strategic consultancy Madano. Matthew joined Madano after nearly 12 years in a variety of roles with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the UK, so probably has some scars to bear from that experience. And Matthew, over to you. Please introduce the panel and our panelists.
Thank you very much, Dom. Thank you, everybody. Yes, as you say, I have suffered from government uncertainty. I was press secretary to Boris Johnson, and that certainly taught me a lot about government uncertainty. But we'll move on to that, to hopefully providing a little bit more policy certainty to industry, to the change to sustainable aviation. So I'm really pleased to welcome today three excellent panelists. First of all, Holly Greig, who is Deputy Director for Aviation Climate Change at the Department for Transport in the UK. Holly's played a huge role leading the development of the UK's Jet Zero strategy and is also part of the UK delegation to the ICAO earlier this year. I'll let Holly say a little bit more about her experience shortly. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Kevin Welsh. Kevin is the Executive Director of the Office of Environment and Energy at the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States. Kevin leads the development of aviation, environmental and energy policies, goals and priorities, and oversees research, engineering and development projects and initiatives for the sector. And like Holly, he supported the United States work with the ICAO. And finally, I'd like to introduce the third panelist today, Tom Mowle, who is Head of Hydrogen Demand Policy at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the UK. And as many of you will know, BEIS, that department, is leading efforts supporting the development and growth of the hydrogen sector. And Tom, of course, is responsible for policy on demand for the emerging hydrogen sector, and really getting into what that means for aviation is central to what we're going to be talking about today. So, we've heard a little bit on the previous panel about the Inflation Reduction Act, about the importance of the policy framework for supporting the development of sustainable aviation internationally. So we're going to hear a little bit from the three panelists, then I'll chair a short discussion, and hopefully we'll have time over the next 40 minutes or so for some questions from the audience as well. So first of all, Holly, if I could ask you just to share your thoughts for a few minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Thanks for having me today, and hello to Kevin and Tom as well. As you said, Matthew, my name's Holly Greig. I'm the Deputy Director for Aviation Climate Change, or Aviation Decarbonisation, depending on which part of my LinkedIn profile you look at, in the UK government. Really delighted to be here today, and thanks to ZeroAvia for hosting this event. A few things I sort of wanted to talk about, but very keen for us to get into the Q&A, which I think is probably the most useful part for people here today. But yes, my team earlier this year published the Jet Zero strategy, which is the UK government's strategic approach to achieving net zero 2050 for UK aviation. And you can see in there the kind of a number of initiatives that the UK government has set out in terms of our approach to decarbonising aviation. But generally speaking, everything that we do from a UK perspective is kind of underpinned by three principles when it comes to decarbonising aviation. The first is around international leadership. and recognizing just how important global action on aviation really is. And of course, that speaks to the huge outcome that we had at ICAO just last month in terms of achieving a net zero.
Might ask you to take over, and hopefully Holly will rejoin in a moment so we can pick back up with Holly.
Yeah, happy to. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here today. And just want to say I've been doing a little bit of multitasking, but been able to listen to most of the sessions so far, and it's really been kind of a great lineup of speakers and conversation. So just as much as anything, I'm just glad to have been a fly on the wall to participate in this. And I really some thoughtful comments from most all of the speakers that we've heard from. So it's been great. I'm the executive director of the Office of Environment and Energy at the Federal Aviation Administration in the US. And I'll say a few things about what we do, and then maybe some thoughts on kind of where we are on climate and decarbonization. But in general, what we do in my office at the FAA is our mission is to make airplanes cleaner and quieter, and we kind of use our resources to do that, right? So that fits right into this space, and we do that through research. We do it through improved understanding, policy, kind of you name it, communication, and that's really been kind of the essence of what we do. And that includes principally on the research side, a university-led center of excellence with 16 universities where we provide grant money for researchers to do research on a wide range of topics from noise, emissions, climate, sustainable aviation fuels, and much more than that. And then we also have a partnership with manufacturers that we work on cleaner and quieter technologies and bringing those to market faster, or otherwise bringing technologies that they wouldn't otherwise bring to market. In terms of climate action, the US did announce our Aviation Climate Action Plan last year, and of course, like many other announcements and proposals out there, plans, it sets a target of net zero emissions by 2050. And people have mentioned IRA. I call it IRA. The first legislation on infrastructure was called Bill. So we had Bill in last year, and this year we have IRA. So it's like Bill and IRA. And so the IRA legislation is incredibly important. It has tax incentives for sustainable aviation fuels, for hydrogen, and also a new grant program that my office is launching for sustainable aviation fuels and low emission technology. So there's a lot of activity. Now, in terms of kind of the outlook, things have really changed in the last few years. And I think it's notable that in the last panel, you had sort of a pioneering innovator in kind of a startup space, startup technology, alongside these large, public airlines, right? It's a really interesting time, and it's an interesting time to see that kind of climate and decarbonization is really kind of a mainstream, issue of success for these businesses, right? And so it's opening up new opportunities, frankly, that allow us to look at kind of a wide range of things. So there's great opportunities. There's also some great challenges, though, because I think the pressure of achieving net zero by 2050, which is incredibly hard for the aviation sector, means that there's sort of a lot of pressure to look very wide to figure out how to do that. And then that sets up this challenge of sort of where I think James or other people have focused on sort of what camp are you in, or what bet are you placing, right? So, just to be clear, from a US policymaker perspective, we're not into placing bets. We really need a consistent and long-term outlook, and we really base our analysis and our planning and policy on data, modeling, analysis, research from these universities, input that we get from the sector. And so, as we sort of look forward and try to help achieve this really ambitious goal, we're trying to do so in a technology agnostic way that is going to bring forward the most promising technologies and incentivize technologies where we can, but we're not sort of picking winners and losers, and that really wouldn't be sort of our role as we see it in the US government, but it is instead looking to see how we can facilitate the innovation that's happening out there and the progress towards achieving these ambitious goals. And so that's really kind of our focus. And I'll say on innovation, it's an exciting time, and it's not just, of course, in hydrogen. We're seeing innovation in drones and uncrewed aircraft systems, in advanced air mobility, electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, supersonic aircraft, commercial space. And so our agency in the US government is sort of handling all of these together. And it's, again, challenging because of there's not enough time and we're not moving as quick as the industry would like or needs. But on the other hand, we are sort of constantly responding and facilitating these initiatives and these new technologies. So it's a very exciting time. But again, we as a regulator need to think about sort of the consistency, durability, and longevity of our programs. And so we're excited to see the innovation in this space, and we really look forward to supporting it. Just, I guess, the last thing I would say, you know, on safety, it's been mentioned, and I think there is sort of this question about revolution versus evolution, right? And how do you, we all want the sector probably to be more revolutionary than evolutionary, and we need that to get to net zero. But on the other hand, safety is our top priority, and when we really, you know, have to be mindful. And if you look at history, you realize that aviation is more of an evolutionary cycle in terms of changing the technologies and where we are. So you know, one of the biggest challenges going forward is how do we sort of push as much as we can on the revolutionary side, but do so in a way that maintains the safety of the system and sort of the reliability that people have on that system going forward. So sorry, Holly, to cut in between your remarks because you had to drop off, you dropped off, but hopefully those are some intro thoughts to share for folks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That's great, and I will definitely get into that in some more detail. Holly, I think we've got you back now, so we'll go back to you.
I'm so sorry about that. My Wi-Fi seems to not be very reliable today. I have switched to my phone in hopes that that is more successful. Very, very sorry, but I did catch Kevin's remarks, which are, as always from Kevin, incredibly insightful and based on real expertise. I think where I cut off was where I was just talking about kind of how important it is from a UK perspective to be working in partnership. And that really picks up on some of the points that Kevin was making around kind of working really hand in glove with industry. And that is sort of all industry from our perspective, whether that's kind of aerospace developers, whether that's airlines and airports, whether that's fuel producers. As much as possible, we really want our policy to be guided by the experts. We really want to work kind of hand in glove in terms of what is it that industry should be doing, where is the space that government should be stepping into, and sort of fully understanding and making sure that everyone is doing all that they can, really. Also thinking about kind of, you know, as I said, the specific roles that industry can play and government can play, which are really quite different, and making sure that we're kind of challenging and acting as kind of critical friends to one another in terms of where we're doing the things that we need to do, but actually where, you know, things are falling short and where we can do more and lean in. I heard one of the previous panelists talk about our Jet Zero Council in the UK, which is really our kind of key platform for where we engage with industry, and particularly when it comes to hydrogen, we've set up our kind of zero emission flight delivery group, where we're looking at kind of the 3 key areas that we think are particularly important when it comes to bringing forward a zero emission flight. That's of course development of new and novel types of aircraft, but also particularly the regulatory framework that is needed to sort of commercialize and certify those aircrafts. And then lastly, the kind of infrastructure needs that, you know, supports that. So the kind of wraparound ecosystem that you need to have in place to support that. And then lastly, really from our perspective, it's all about trying to sort of maximize the opportunities that this transition can bring. As Kevin was saying, you know, I think what's been incredibly helpful over the past couple of years is that decarbonisation has changed from a kind of a burden to an opportunity. And really, I think there's been a lot of recognition and understanding that actually this can bring so much opportunity, not just for developed economies, but also for developing economies as well. You know, new opportunities, new different types of technologies can bring real opportunities for kind of jobs and growth and new skills. It's really, really incredibly exciting. So that's something that we're really keen to continue to kind of develop in and work on from a UK perspective. And really, you know, as Kevin was kind of saying, there are so many different opportunities here. I think when it comes to aviation, we can't pick winners, even if we would like to, which similarly the UK government isn't in that space either. But everything that we've seen and the evidence tells us that you need everything when it comes to decarbonising aviation. It's incredibly challenging. It's not going to be easy to get there for 2050. So as much as hydrogen is going to be a key part of the policy mix, so as sustainable aviation fuels, but equally it's just as important to still be thinking about out of sector measures such as greenhouse gas removals, and then also some of the stuff that we can do right now, whether that's modernising the airspace and so on. All of those things, we're going to have to pull all of those levers collectively to really get where we need to. And it's really, really exciting to be on panels such as this, where we've got kind of collective shared minds and bringing the right people together to address the challenges and come up with new and exciting opportunities. So thanks for having me on the panel. And yeah, I think it's over to Tom. Is that right, Matthew?
Absolutely right. Thank you very much, Holly. Yeah, last but certainly not least, Tom, from that sort of broader hydrogen economy perspective, it'd be really interesting to hear some thoughts from you.
Sure, thanks, Matthew. And hello, everyone. Yeah, as Matthew said, my name's Tom Mowle. I'm the head of hydrogen demand policy at BEIS at the UK government for business and energy. So as kind of head of hydrogen demand, I mean, it's a very interesting role. I think when I first started the role, I put a tweet out to my 30 or so Twitter followers, just announcing that that's the role I was going to take, and it got over 100 replies. And I think over 100,000 views, and that was all down to the fairly healthy debate that occurred in the comment section about what the role of hydrogen is in and where we will use it, and where it's sensible to use it, where it's not sensible to use it. So it's a really interesting sector to be in, and there's some really healthy debate, as I say. And I think the other attractive thing is that it really is one of the ways that we will decarbonise those often touted hard to decarbonise sectors, of which aviation is clearly one of them. And kind of really getting teeth stuck into those really tricky challenges on our journey to kind of global net zero is a really interesting aspect to the role, and so it's a pleasure to be here today to be kind of speaking about some of the aspects of that. I mean, Holly and Kevin really are the experts on aviation. As I say, my role is very much kind of across the economy and cross-sectoral, but what I can give, I was going to mention just a bit of the kind of policy context of how we're going about supporting the hydrogen economy and the development of the hydrogen economy in the UK, and specifically on kind of what we're thinking on demand, and perhaps how kind of aviation can fit into that, and how it can help us develop our policy environment. So to kind of give a bit of context for people that maybe aren't as aware of the UK kind of policy framework, last year in August 2021, we published our UK hydrogen strategy. And that was really our attempt to outline a comprehensive roadmap for the development of the wider hydrogen economy over the 2020s and deliver on the government's 2030 production ambition. That production ambition, I should say, was actually doubled in April of this year in the British Energy Security Strategy, which was a big publication by government back then. And we're now aiming for 10 gigawatts of hydrogen production in the UK by 2030, with at least half of that coming from electrolytic hydrogen. That ambition is really about making clear that the UK has a really strong intention to be at the forefront of the global race to develop hydrogen. I think there's over 30 hydrogen strategies now, so it's clear that there's some real ambition across the hydrogen space globally, and the UK will hopefully be a big part of that. We see a big decarbonisation benefit to hydrogen, which is clear and which we've spoken a lot about today, but equally there's a big economic benefit, is also something that's been touched on, but really we see low carbon hydrogen providing opportunities for UK companies and workers across particularly the UK industrial heartlands. Government analysis, I think, suggests that by 2030 this hydrogen sector as a whole could support over 12,000 jobs and unlock up to £9 billion of private investment. So really big opportunity kind of economically, which is obviously hugely important at times like this. In terms of some of the progress we've made to date on hydrogen generally, a lot of the policy development has been focused on production, and particularly the kind of commercial support has been on the production side. So in April, the UK published the Hydrogen Investment Package, which opened the £240 million net zero hydrogen fund. these announcement marked a major step forward in government delivering support to really support that private sector investment into the sector and into production specifically. This July, we opened our joint allocation for that net zero hydrogen fund and a hydrogen production business model. The production business model is something that will hopefully give the sector and investors that certainty of kind of continued revenue support for the hydrogen they're producing. We also announced the appointment of our hydrogen champion. So a lady called Jane Toogood will be thinking about really kind of working with the sector and working with policymakers to look into how we can kind of catalyse the establishment of a UK hydrogen sector. But it's not just production. I think a lot of the focus, especially recently in government, has been across the value chain and how we support the development of a hydrogen economy, not just hydrogen producers. So we recently consulted particularly on transport and storage of hydrogen. And I think that's quite an interesting aspect to what we call the value chain, and just the ecosystem that hydrogen will find its place in. Really thinking about the commercial implications of transporting lots of hydrogen across country, and particularly storing it. And hopefully that some of the people on at the event today will have seen that and inputted their views, because I'm sure that people will have them. And this kind of all comes down to demand. You can't you don't know how much production you're going to need in the long run, and how much transport and how much storage you're going to need if you don't have a clear understanding of demand. That's what me and my team are trying to facilitate the UK government having. Especially, I think one thing I would say is that we're not in the market, I guess, of prescribing demand for hydrogen, and that's mainly because end use sectors, and particularly the people here today listening and on various panels are the experts in individual sectors. There's lots of different implications and aspects to consider on a journey to decarbonisation, and whether hydrogen is the right type of fuel to use, and in what form that hydrogen will be used is something we don't think that it's best placed for government to decide. It's best place for the people working on it, the engineers, the academics, and effectively the market and commercial environment to decide. But that doesn't mean we're sitting back and not doing anything on hydrogen demand in general. There's a big role for government, I think, in removing barriers and making sure that those decarbonisation pathways are open, so that the market effectively can decide the most effective way to decarbonise. Another aspect of my role particularly is to really understand the trajectory of our hydrogen demand, and that's why discussions like today's are really, really useful, because we can get that insight into the kind of very latest thinking in terms of where hydrogen will be used, both in space and in time, and in what form. So is there a strategic case for particular types of fuel production, not just hydrogen, secondary fuels and derivative fuels. Yeah, hopefully that gives a bit of context into the overall kind of hydrogen policy framework in the UK. We do our best to learn from other people and other governments approaching similar problems. So I'm very happy to looking forward to the discussion and Q&A on this. We're always open to hear suggestions and thoughts on our policy framework. Yeah, really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks, Kevin, thanks, Holly. You've all spoken about the need to support the industry, but also not to pick winners, and the need to be technologically agnostic, as Kevin and all the three panel members have said. What we work a lot at my company with investors, and I'm sure they would say that's fine, but government needs to provide the support and the levers and the certainty for us to invest in these either experimental or unproven or not yet scaled technologies. So I'd be really interested in hearing a little bit more, what are the levers that government can use? Tom talked about removing barriers, absolutely, but what levers can government use to help adoption of these technologies? And in your experience, where are the best places the government can help, and how have you done that in your own administrations? Maybe start with Holly.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think that's a really, really fair challenge. And I think it's absolutely right that it's really important that government is setting that clear policy direction in terms of where we want to get to, and sort of really setting out our I suppose vision for how that can happen. And that's why what I was sort of mentioning earlier around the recent agreement at ICAO around a global net zero 2050 goal is so important, because economies such as the UK can set out what we're doing, but actually having that global agreement which says this is the direction for the global aviation sector, it is going to have to get to net zero 2050, is incredibly important. So that strategic policy direction is really important for government to do. Equally, I think there is also a role at times for government funding. You know, government funding can play a key part. And Tom was talking earlier about some of the funding we're specifically doing on kind of hydrogen at economy level. It's probably worth talking a little bit about some of the investment that the UK government is making, particularly in low and zero emission aerospace technologies. So we also have a £685 million pot of funding that is paid out through the Aerospace Technology Institute in the UK, which is specifically focused around low and zero emission technologies. And generally speaking, sort of that funding is largely used and aimed at sort of low TRL projects. And so what the government can do is help support those projects at those earlier stages, which can then get them to those levels of technology readiness that can then bring in private sector investment and confidence once the government has helped get those projects to that next level. So I think that's really important. So conscious of other panelists wanting to come in, but I think there is that policy certainty and that strategic direction, and then some of that funding as well. You know, of course, it's easy to say government should fund things, and there's never quite enough money to go around. But if we can use the funding that we do have in a very sort of tailored and specific way, then I think that can be really, really helpful.
Thanks, Holly. That's really interesting. Maybe pass to Kevin next if you have some thoughts on that from a US perspective.
Sure. Well, just to start, I think in the speaking in the U.S., you of course have the U.S. Congress who controls the money and makes the big decisions, and also decisions like we talked about the IRA tax credits, or even kind of landmark laws like something such as a SAF mandate, right? That would be something that you would see our Congress do, and it's a little bit harder to predict when the U.S. Congress will or won't act. And then when you move to the executive branch, our tools maybe are more limited, but that's where we can use the money that Congress has given us for, funding of research, looking at, particular policies, working internationally, like Holly has mentioned. So there's different, maybe we are sort of more circumscribed in what we can do. But what I would emphasize is, we're not trying to pick winners and losers. We are bringing data. We're bringing analysis, and we're bringing kind of this technical rigor that we sort of think is critical to underpin our credibility as a government, and our ability to spend the taxpayer money wisely. And so we don't, we really do need to think about how we move quickly this year and next year, but we're also thinking long term, because we want our policies to be consistent and have consistency across political changes in the United States, and be something that the industry can rely on. And so that does mean that we're very careful in terms of our assessment about what's in the realm of the possible, what's achievable, what's not achievable. And then that dictates a bit about how we spend our money and where our resources go. So, and I think we're in a space where there is a ton of pressure because of the high level of ambition of the net zero goal to consider a lot of things. And so I think there is more pressure on governments to really, walk that line in terms of kind of keeping that technological rigor and credibility. And so it's definitely challenging, but that's sort of, for us, that's kind of our North Star is, what are the sort of experts in the field telling us? What are the models telling us? What's our analysis? And that's how we're going to make decisions, not sort of based on opinions, or not sort of on who kind of is spending more money lobbying the federal government.
Thanks, Kevin. I might, I'll ask one more question myself, and then I'll maybe take a question from the audience, maybe one for you to start with, Tom. I think one of the things that's very exciting about the potential for currently a lot of the technologies in sustainable aviation is the regional angle and the potential for supporting local economies. And we've been talking about national level, but I'd be quite interested in to what extent is the UK government looking at how these kind of technologies might shape regional change, regional aviation, and how can that support regional economic growth? And is that something you're factoring into your policy making?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. I mean, it's a really good question. As I was talking about before, it's, we're really looking at how the hydrogen economy develops. And part of that is the geographical question. And if we're going to capture those economic benefits that I mentioned, that has to be factored in. I think aviation is a really interesting one because a lot of the kind of questions and a lot of the thinking around the kind of transport and storage element of hydrogen really starts to suggest that you've got to think carefully about where you're producing this stuff and where you're using it. And airports are a really interesting I think case for what some people call kind of mini clusters, and we're already seeing that, I think, in the amount of kind of attention and engagement we're having with the aviation industry there. I think our kind of policy approach initially in the UK with hydrogen is to go to look at the really big demand centres, so particularly industry and potentially power and those big industrial clusters. I think a really interesting question is there then a case to look at more dispersed kind of regional clusters, and what kind of industries could you centre those around? I think aviation is a really interesting proposal in that regard. So I think that the challenge is really factoring in all of those different elements of the analysis, both the kind of commercial and economic questions, the feasibility and the actual, can this stuff happen? Can we make it work? As well as the economic benefits, and that we use the term levelling up a lot in the UK, seemingly over the past couple of years at least. But is there a story to tell there? And that's the kind of things that gets ministers and politicians excited. So certainly something that we're interested in exploring further.
Thanks, Tom. I don't know, Holly or Kevin, if you want to come in on that point, or otherwise I'll move to a question from the audience. All right, so I'll take this question from Bikram. Really interesting question about global regulatory collaboration, and he cites example in Japan. Is that something that you're looking at? Could you give us a little bit of an insight into what steps are happening on that front, and what this might mean for the development of the industry? Holly, do you want to? I'll put you up first.
Okay, I'll go, and then I'm sure Kevin will want to add to this as well. So I'll mention it again. So ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, has responsibility for regulating aviation at an international level, and that's everything from kind of safety, security, but also on the environment. And so, if you haven't had an opportunity to have a look at what was agreed back in October on the long-term goal, then that's incredibly important. But as I was saying earlier, now we've got this goal. What's really incredibly important is that we move very quickly onto implementation and delivery. And there's been a lot of discussion at the Assembly this year around the importance of sustainable aviation fuels as an example. And so would be very interested to hear Kevin's views on this, but I think very much now next year is largely going to be a big conversation about sustainable aviation fuels and what we can be doing internationally and through ICAO to really kind of try and put a bit of a rocket under what we're doing on SAF at the moment. Kevin mentioned earlier about SAF mandates, and of course in the UK we've committed to having a SAF mandate and to have 10% of SAF in the UK fuel mix by 2030, which is incredibly important. And we're really super keen to have a UK SAF industry as well, which can bring, as we were talking about earlier, kind of jobs growth and new skills for the UK. But actually, in fact, the global demand for sustainable aviation fuels, and indeed for fuels such as hydrogen, is going to be huge. And so what we can do internationally is incredibly important. I agree with the kind of premise of the question, and would certainly kind of say for the question poser to keep
a close eye on ICAO as the sort of over the coming years, because that's really where I think we're going to be focusing a lot of our time and efforts in terms of bringing through further kind of international regulation to really incentivize some of this. But as I say, really welcome Kevin's views on this, who is a super ICAO expert.
Thanks, Holly. On that note, I just agree with what you said, and ICAO in aviation traditionally really happens across borders, and ICAO has, for the entirety of the sort of history of aviation since 1944, has set safety standards, security standards, and in recent decades, environmental standards. And it's not just standards but policy, and that's critical going forward. So there's opportunities there. And again, when I spoke about kind of modeling, analysis, and efforts, a lot of the work that we do at FAA goes into an international process at ICAO to bring everyone on the same playing field. We're also domestically doing these kind of partnerships. So I mentioned the partnership that we have with manufacturers right now. It's in its 12th year this year. It's the third phase of this program where we work with manufacturers, and so I think that's the type of thing that's being addressed in the question. On the certification side, which is not in my office but a different part of the agency, we do have an innovation division that works with all of the new innovative technologies I've talked about in terms of finding a path forward for certification, right? So we have innovative partnerships that are happening to look at those technologies and do that. And I did note there was an anonymous question that sort of was directed at me, so I look forward to taking that soon.
Now's your chance, Kevin. Now's your chance. Go for it.
Well, I'll just be quick. I mean, it referred to my comment about evolutionary versus revolutionary as equivocating. I don't think it is equivocating. And I think, but I like the question because I think it highlights the sort of like some of the challenge we see, not just in not really on hydrogen, but with all sorts of technologies right now, sort of this view that, well, the technology in the industry is just going to accelerate ahead and it's the government holding us back, which frankly is not a very constructive paradigm. I don't think it's constructive whether you're sitting on the industry tech side or the government side. But unlike a smartphone, the safety aspects in aviation are very different, right? And we can just look back in history in introduction of new products. There are safety challenges, and they're not insignificant. And the loss of life or harm to people kind of is the number one thing, and it will set this industry back. So the reality is, it takes time to introduce new products. Even if you put safety aside, the aviation sector is very capital intensive. Individual aircraft are, high cost goods, and they last for a very long time. So the aircraft that are being produced and coming off the line today are going to be flying for at least the next 20 years. So just looking at both historically and going forward, the growth and replacement cycle for the existing aircraft fleet, you've got to take that into account when you are looking at what can new technologies do and when can they penetrate the fleet. So if you look at the U.S. Aviation Climate Action Plan, technology is a really important piece, but its ability to sort of impact our efforts towards net zero are more in the out years, sort of in the later 2030s and beyond, simply because the new technologies that are coming into the fleet in the next 10 years will then take a lot of time to penetrate to achieve sizable reductions. And when I say evolutionary versus revolutionary, that's what I'm talking about. We've got to be mindful of the fact that for a variety of factors, this is more of an evolutionary industry. And so there are ways to make it more revolutionary and accelerate that, but you can't sort of kind of defy the laws of kind of how the industry works. Or if you do want to do that, then please tell me what your plan is and how that lines up with reality.
Thanks, Kevin. I like it. Take it on. So we've talked a lot about the demand from Tom in terms of hydrogen, and I think I'd be really interested in understanding how can we shift the roadmap so that Holly and Kevin, you can provide more certainty for colleagues like Tom who are working on the broader economy about demand. How can industry help with that? How can government help with that in terms of inputs? Because obviously there is a kind of a chicken and egg question there.
I think that's completely right. And actually, that's sort of one of the key challenges that my team and Tom's, are working on and will continue to work on in terms of how do we really how can we be really clear about what exactly the demand in aviation is going to be over the coming decades? And as sort of Tom was suggesting earlier, how do we make decisions about where the best use of hydrogen is going to be in the economy, given that, as far as I know, and Tom may correct me, we're not going to have an abundance of it over the coming years. So how do we be really smart about the best place to use it that is going to foster that technology development that we want to see and also deliver those emission savings that we want to see? I really think, industry can absolutely help with that. When we're developing some of our uptake scenarios within government, we are drawing on all of the very best kind of industry evidence and roadmaps and knowledge. And really, it's just as much as possible for industry to kind of be as sort of collaborative and transparent as they can be about their technology development and what their expectations are. Is really the plea. I think it just comes back to kind of working hand in glove and being as open and transparent as we possibly can be, really. And I think that's true just as much for industry to government as government for industry. If government is reaching decisions about where we consider the best use for hydrogen, and if that's not in aviation, right, I'm not saying that's the case, but actually that open dialogue is incredibly important in terms of kind of how we see the economy developing for hydrogen and what industry wants. So that's a very long way of saying I think just really openness, transparency and communication is incredibly important. And Kevin was talking earlier about kind of data as much as possible, I think is really the key to all of this.
Thanks, Holly. Tom, interested in your thoughts on that, particularly in terms of that broader economic picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to be honest, I would absolutely echo what Holly's just said. I think certainly, in the near term, that kind of knowledge sharing and openness between government and industry is absolutely key. And it's something that we're seeing, a lot of, and it's really good in the UK. Certainly that there is that openness and that willing to share and that engagement, and that's going to be really important. It's really understanding when. I think the interesting thing about hydrogen policy, especially relative to other policy areas, is that we're very much kind of learning together. It's a relatively early stage in the kind of establishment of a hydrogen system, at least a low carbon hydrogen system, and it's within both parties' interest, both public sector and private sector, to work together. So I just absolutely echo that sentiment. I think the other aspect of this is, it feels like in the long term, we're going to know exactly how much hydrogen demand we get from aviation because we'll have got there. So I guess a fairly flippant way of answering that question would be, well, get there faster. So, and that's a challenge to us as policymakers, but equally a challenge to industry. What are the bottlenecks that is stopping, faster trialing, faster innovation, faster scale up and commercialization of these innovative technologies? Kevin mentioned safety in that last answer, and obviously that's really, really key. But what else is there? What particularly what actions can government take to accelerate that? Because eventually we will know exactly how much demand there is, but getting there sooner would be super helpful.
Thank you, Tom. I'll take, we don't have a huge amount of time left, but I'll take a question from the audience, but one from Brent about, are there revolutionary opportunities? And he cites there's a lot of recent media coverage of the Rolls-Royce using hydrogen instead of jet fuel. So it points towards your comment, Kevin, on the sort of 20-year time horizons. Very interested in the panel's thoughts on that. And maybe I'll start with you, Kevin, on that.
Sure. Well, certainly, and the focus that we have at the FAA is supporting kind of looking at innovations, researching innovations in technology. And so that's a critically important part. The Rolls-Royce announcement, other announcements we're seeing. And like I said, we're seeing this in many different areas, both on the energy source, but also the types of vehicles. We're seeing a lot of vehicles that look different than any vehicles we've seen in aviation before, which present environmental benefits, but also challenges in terms of certification, supersonic, hypersonic. So there's a full range of innovation, and that's needed. But I guess what I would say about kind of that, back to that revolution evolution, is you then also have to take into account how to get those products into the market, right? And are there ways to accelerate the traditional product cycle? And there are, but it's challenging, right? The economics, the dynamics of the sector are very challenging. But again, I'm not saying that shouldn't happen. I'm just saying there's a high bar, and being serious about how to tackle those things is going to be critical, particularly if we're going to get to net zero 2050. So it's both the sort of that innovation side. We talked about the infrastructure already, not on this panel, but earlier, and also just the kind of the dynamics of the sector, all of those things taken together. So it comes back to sort of not being one thing, but how do you kind of look at all of the levers and tools you can use? I think that's critical.
Thanks, Kevin. I don't know, Tom or Holly, if you have any other comments on that, and then I might, if you use my position, Dom, I can see you're leaning in, but by asking one more question as chair. My question is, obviously there are a lot of disruptors in this industry, and they are taking on some big, well-established players. How can we make sure that those big players don't crowd out, particularly when speaking to government, some of those small innovators? And of course, you're all here, and that's great to hear from you. But it is a risk, and I'd be really interested in some your thoughts on how we can make sure that some of those small disruptive views are heard clearly in government at the highest levels. And maybe Holly, really interested in your thoughts on that.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and I think that, and I agree with the premise of it entirely. There is some really big players in the aerospace industry, and actually, it's a really difficult industry to break into. So seeing companies like ZeroAvia doing such a fantastic job is really great. I feel like, to be honest, what's fantastic about these sort of new disruptive, innovative companies coming in is actually it's keeping those big incumbents on their toes. It's really driving them to kind of push, and I think that's incredibly positive. From a UK government point of view, I think really it's for us to be reaching out and engaging and having those conversations, and also making sure that where we are making funding available, that funding is really transparent, it's really obvious, there is fair and open competition to access that funding, particularly when we've got companies who may be less familiar with going through those sort of arduous process of funding applications. What more can government do to really help and make sure that they're on a kind of level playing field with some of those incumbent companies, and how can we help with that? I mean, as always, kind of really keen again for kind of government to get feedback on where those new companies are feeling like if they are at a disadvantage, what can government do to help? When it comes to kind of, I guess it comes back to this point of equality. You have to do different things for different people to make things equal. And are there things that government needs to be doing in that respect to help some of those new companies? And definitely sort of open ears to that, and certainly the ministerial team that we have in DfT and indeed in BASE, I think, are very much open to that and really see the advantage of disruptive companies, and can really see how they're kind of shaking up things in the aerospace industry, which I think is super helpful. And coming back to the points that Kevin was making about evolution versus revolution, noting all the points that he's made about kind of how challenging that is. Actually, that's kind of where disruptive companies can really, really help from my perspective. And I sort of super welcome companies such as ZeroAvia kind of getting involved in this space, no matter how challenging it is. I think it's really inspiring.
Thanks, Holly. That's great. Kevin, any last thoughts from you? And then I'll give the last word for Tom. But yeah, over to you.
Well, I'll just be quick. I think Holly said it quite well. So I don't have much to add, but that is a challenge, and it's one we're mindful of. And just in one way we focus on kind of creating that level playing field in the US with our programs is we establish a competitive process, clear objective requirements, and then independent reviews as we go when we're providing grant money and things like that. So we're mindful of it, but it's always a challenging issue to address.
Thank you. Any last thoughts, Tom? Otherwise, I know we're over time, so I will.
No, nothing really to add other than I thought Holly and Kevin's answers were great.
All right, thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Tom. Sorry, Dom, to run a little bit over, but I think over to you.
No, absolutely perfect, because I think we had a little bit more time at the end of the day. So this was really great discussion. I think there was, you know, I would note there was a little bit of talk about regional economies and flying and the benefits that can create. It's St Andrews Day today. I know that Scotland is looking very closely at moving to zero emission routes as soon as possible, as well as other countries. But I thought, given it's St Andrews Day today, it's worth recognising that. And Highlands and Islands are certainly one use case where we can see hydrogen-powered flight in the short term. So we've had a great discussion about policy. I think we're going to move now just to hear from the UK Aviation Minister a little bit more detail about how she sees the future of aviation, building on some of the points that Holly made herself, and covering off exactly what the framework that the UK government is looking at the current time. So hopefully of interest to our audience all across the world, but Baroness Veer remarks will follow.